You ever notice how sometimes people decide who you are before you even take your helmet off? They don't know your name. They don't know anything about you. But the minute you roll up on your bike, they think they do. And you know what? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Usually, they're not altogether wrong. Let me ask you something, and don't answer it out loud just yet, but when you pull into parking, or when you pull up to an event, or you pull into a gas station, what do people assume about you before you even get off your bike? Because whether we like it or not, they're already guessing. They're guessing what kind of rider you are. They're guessing what you value. And yeah, they're probably guessing what your personality is too. And here's the thing, we all do it. You see a modded up leader bike roll in and you're like, yeah, that guy likes to go fast. You might assume some other things too. You see a guy on a cruiser rolling down the highway with straight pipes that are rattling your fillings. You're probably thinking, that guy's not in a hurry. If you see a guy roll up on an ADV that's covered in dirt and panniers, then yeah, I guarantee you're wondering what kind of off-road shenanigans that guy got up to with that bike. And none of that stuff is random, because motorcycles aren't just machines. They're not just appliances. They're not neutral. Motorcycles, one of the most personal choices you can make on the road. And nobody buys a bike purely for practicality. Well, I mean, some do, but nobody accidentally ends up on the exact bike that they ride. You chose it, and that choice, whether consciously or not, usually says something about who you are, or at least who you see yourself as. Now, before anybody gets all up in their feelings in the comments, let me set something straight here. We have made some satirical videos in the past about rider stereotypes or bike type stereotypes. This is not that. And I am definitely not saying that what you ride defines you as a person. There's absolutely always exceptions. But certain patterns do exist for a reason. Certain motorcycles do attract certain personality types. Not because the bike forces that personality onto the person, but because that's already what that person is kind of attracted to. It matches it. It just reflects what was already there. Some people into comfort, some people into performance and speed, whatever. Because when you choose a bike, you weigh a certain number of trade-offs in that decision. And those trade-offs usually reflect how you live your life. I mean, some people value comfort at the expense of speed. Some people value speed at the expense of comfort. And some people just want to disappear down a back road that may not even be on the map. None of these trade-offs are right or wrong, but they are revealing. So the real question today isn't what kind of rider are you? The real question is, what does your motorcycle say about you before you've ever said a word? Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room here, because the second you say things like what your bike says about you, immediately people start to think stereotypes. And yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about here. But here's the thing, stereotypes don't just appear out of thin air. They're not invented to insult people. They form because you see the same repeated patterns and behaviors over and over again. And motorcycles, more than anything else on the road, make those patterns really easy to spot. I mean, think about it. Your bike doesn't just sit in the garage. It influences how you ride, where you ride, who you ride with, and what kind of gear you wear, even the kind of videos you watch. The motorcycle becomes the center of a whole ecosystem. That's why a sport bike group ride feels very different from a cruiser group ride, or why an ADV BDRX event looks nothing like a Harley dealership bike night. It's not because one group's better than the other, it's because they've optimized around different things. And when groups of people optimize on the same things long enough, they start to resemble each other. And look, we're not talking about absolutes here. We're talking about tendencies. A sport bike doesn't make someone competitive, but competitive people are likely to be more drawn to sport bikes. A cruiser doesn't make somebody laid back, but you see where I'm going with this. The bike didn't create the personality, it just matched it. And once you understand that, stereotypes stop feeling insulting and they start feeling useful. They become shortcuts, not to judge people, but to help understand them faster. And of course, there are exceptions, but the box exists because enough people landed in it for a reason. And here's the part that nobody likes to admit. We all do it. We all stereotype. Our brains are wired for it. not to insult people, but to categorize. It's how humans make sense of complex social environments quickly. So instead of pretending the stereotypes don't exist, it's more honest and more interesting to think about, why do those patterns form to start with? Because then we can start breaking down what each motorcycle type tends to attract. And that's where this gets fun. All right, let's talk about the high-level archetypes here. And I don't mean every niche rider out there, because I don't want this video to be an hour long and you guys would never watch that. Although that kind of audience retention would be pretty sweet. But I digress. I'm talking about the major ones, like sport bike riders. You know what I'm talking about. Sport bike riders tend to get labeled fast and not always very kindly. They're often seen as aggressive, competitive adrenaline junkies. And while that stereotype gets exaggerated, it didn't come from nowhere. Most sport bike riders are drawn to performance. Not just speed, but precision, acceleration, braking, lean angle. We're talking control at the edge of traction. For a lot of these riders, the bike isn't just transportation, it's a skills test. They care about how well they ride, how smooth their inputs are, how late they can brake, how confidently they can push the machine without crossing the line into dangerous. Actually, maybe even crossing that line. And that mindset extends beyond riding. Sport bike riders often value improvement, measurable progress. And yeah, some of y'all are competitive. Now, does that mean every sport bike rider rides like a maniac on public roads? No, but it does mean they're usually more comfortable operating closer to the edge than your everyday average rider. And that comfort with risk, managed risk, not chaos, is part of the appeal. Which brings us to a very different mindset. Cruiser riders. These guys tend to optimize for everything entirely different. Not speed, not lap times, not maximum performance per dollar, but presence. You know, the sound, the feel, the weight of the bike moving beneath you. Cruiser riders often value the experience of riding more than the destination. They're usually not trying to prove how fast they are. They're trying to enjoy where they are. That's why cruiser culture leans so heavily into tradition and personalization and style. These bikes become extensions of the rider's identity. And because this type of rider is typically a bit longer in the tooth, a lot of cruiser riders are deeply aware of time. Not in a rushed kind of way, but in a reflective kind of way. They understand that slowing down isn't weakness. It's a choice. And that mindset usually shows up in how they live outside of riding too. Less urgency, more appreciation for the moment. Now that doesn't mean cruiser riders can't ride hard and rack up some miles, because many of them do. But the motivation is different. They're not chasing the edge. They're soaking up the ride. And speaking of valuing time differently, that perfectly segues into this next group. I'm talking about touring riders. Of both the cruiser and sport variety, they don't just think about the ride right now. They think about the next 1,000 miles. These are riders who understand that freedom doesn't come from speed, it comes from endurance. Comfort matters, wind protection matters, storage matters. Not because they're soft, but because they're realistic. And anyone who's ever spent hours in the saddle knows this truth. Discomfort doesn't make you tougher, it just makes you tired. Touring riders tend to be planners. They're thinking ahead. They value reliability. They understand that the goal isn't the attention-grabbing highlight moment of the ride. It's the entire journey. And that mindset usually reflects a much more patient mindset outside of riding as well. Touring riders don't need constant stimulation. They're comfortable with long stretches of road, lots of routine and repetition. They know that some of the best moments don't happen fast. They happen gradually, mile after mile. And if you look closely, many touring riders didn't start there. They had an evolving long-term plan, which is funny because these next guys and gals, they tend to skip the plan part altogether. ADV and off-road riders are a different breed entirely. They don't just tolerate uncertainty, they expect it. Bad roads, wrong turns, weather changes, mechanical issues. That's not a problem, it's part of the appeal. These riders tend to value adaptability over perfection. They're comfortable with being uncomfortable. They're okay with not knowing exactly what's ahead. And they usually take pride in self-reliance. They've become accustomed to fixing things on the trail, and they don't fret over picking up a dropped bike. There's also a strong curiosity factor going on here. Like, I want to see what's over there, beyond where the pavement ends. Places that most people don't bother exploring. And that curiosity usually spills into the rest of their lives too. They're the problem solvers, the tinkerers. They don't need perfect conditions, just enough room to move. Now, let's talk about a group that often gets overlooked, and I know this because on those other roast videos about stereotypes, you guys have told me this many times. We're talking about the naked bike riders, the standard riders, the neo-classic riders. These riders often value balance. Maybe they want enough performance to be fun, but also enough comfort to ride often, enough style to feel connected, but not flashy. They're usually not chasing an identity through their choice of bikes, they're chasing usefulness. And interestingly, they're often the type of people in real life who resist labels entirely. They don't need a bike to say something loud about them, because they already know who they are. But I can hear the hamster wheel turn frantically inside that noggin, because not everybody fits perfectly into these categories. Now here's where things get a little interesting, because some riders have owned a sport bike and a cruiser. Some have got a touring bike in the garage and a dirt bike in the shed. Some riders switch up bikes every few years, and those type of riders usually get labeled one of two ways. Either they can't make up their mind, or they don't really know what they want. But that's not usually what's happening at all. More often than not, those riders are just adaptable. And there's a lot of them out there flying under the radar. They're not beholden to any particular brand or any particular style. They understand that different bikes do different things well, and they're okay with that. People like this tend to be curious and open-minded and less attached to identity labels. Why let one motorcycle represent everything about who they are? And guess what? Most riders don't ride the same bike forever. The bike you wanted at 25 probably isn't the bike you want at 45 because your priority shifted. Your tolerance for certain things has changed. And your appetite for risk changes too. Our definition of fun evolves. Some riders start fast and aggressive and then they slow down. Others start slow and then progress into performance. Some people bounce back and forth depending on what's going on in their life at the given time. That doesn't mean they got multiple personalities. That just means they're paying attention to what's going on with themselves. And what's interesting is that these riders that bounce back and forth, they tend to have more respect for lots of different styles. Because once you've ridden a lot of different styles, you understand what everybody loves about each of them. Which brings us to a bigger question. We keep saying that motorcycles reflect different people's personalities and values. But is there any actual evidence that that's true? Or are we just saying things that feel true? So up to this point, you're probably sitting there thinking, okay, sounds about right, but is Salty just sitting there storytelling? Is there any actual evidence that backs this up? And that's a fair question, because believe it or not, motorcycle riders have been studied. And I don't mean by the marketing departments of motorcycle companies. I mean by actual psychologists. And while no study can tell you everything about a particular person because of what they ride, some consistent patterns do show up. One of the most commonly referenced ideas here comes from sensation-seeking theory in psychology. In simple terms, sensation-seeking refers to how strongly someone is drawn to novel experiences, intensity, risk, and new stimulation. And study after study has found that motorcycle riders, on average, score higher in sensation-seeking than the general population. Not reckless behavior, not chaos, but a greater tolerance for risk in exchange for experience. That lines up pretty cleanly with what most riders already know about themselves. We're more willing to try new things, more comfortable stepping outside that comfort zone, more likely to value experience over safety padding. There's a peer-reviewed academic journal series simply called Personality and Individual Differences that's published 16 times a year that consistently shows that motorcycle riders tend to score higher in openness to experience. And that trait includes things like creativity, curiosity, willingness to challenge norms, and preference to autonomy, which makes sense. Motorcycling isn't the default choice. It's not the easiest. It's definitely not the safest. And in today's day and age, it's not the most socially encouraged. But we choose it anyway, and that already filters for a certain kind of mindset. There's also evidence that riders tend to score higher in extroversion. And I don't mean in the loud and obnoxious kind of way. More like they're drawn to engagement. They don't want to be sealed off from the world. Which explains why so many riders say things like, I feel free when I'm on a motorcycle, or I feel more connected. And that's not just poetic nonsense. Now, let me rewind here and reemphasize again that these are not hard rules. These are just trends.
Plenty of riders are quiet, cautious introverts, just like plenty of non-riders are adventurous and open-minded. But motorcycles tend to attract people who are willing to step outside the norm. And once you start viewing motorcycles through that lens, you start to understand why a lot of riders feel a little bit misunderstood, why they bristle at overregulation, why they tend to value freedom so much, and why riding feels personal in a way driving just never does. So yeah, your motorcycle doesn't define you, but it does highlight who you are. And those preferences tend to reflect on other parts of your life too. The way you navigate decisions on the bike usually mirrors how you navigate decisions off the bike too. And as we grow in life, we grow as riders as well. Most riders evolve as their priorities change and as their bodies change. Your definition of enjoyment matures. The bike you ride today may say something very different than the one you rode 15 or 20 years ago. Mine certainly does. And that kind of growth is a healthy sign that you're willing to let your motorcycle choices change as life changes. So let me leave you with this. If somebody had to guess who you are just by looking at your motorcycle, what would they get right? What would they get wrong? Drop it in the comments because I'm genuinely curious. Because a lot of times the bike we ride says less about how others see us and more about how we see ourselves. So in the meantime, ride hard, stay salty, and we'll see you in the next one.
Ladies and gentlemen, spring has sprung. It is hot as balls out here.